Hi everyone, Merle Goldstein here. Tonight I was going to talk about a concept called counter-identification. Counter-identification is when we try to organize our lives or our personalities um, to not be like someone we knew or to not be something. So it's the opposite of identifying with someone, trying to be like someone we know or copy someone's behavior or use a role model. When we counter-identify with someone or something, we're trying to be the opposite. And the trouble with counter identification is that a lot of times, first of all, we split off parts of ourselves that could have empathy for the people in our lives that we don't want to be like. We also split off parts of ourselves that have internalized or identified unconsciously with the way we've been treated from an object relations perspective, which basically means that the way we experience ourselves in relationships, what's done to us and what we do to others, both become experiences inside ourselves. And so even if we try not to be like people in our lives that have done things to us that we didn't like, there's still probably a part of us that has internalized or identified with what it would be like to engage in those behaviors or those experiences or those feelings. So, for example, if you had a very needy caregiver, you might not like neediness or not want your children to feel that you're needy towards them, but there still is probably a needy part of you that learned neediness from having been on the receiving end of a needy person. If you grew up with someone who was very critical or judgmental, maybe you didn't like the way that felt and you tried to be a very accepting or tolerant person, not critical of other people, but you still might have an inner critic or a critical part of yourself just because you grew up around that kind of attitude or messaging. So we end up internalizing and identifying with things that have been done to us, even if we didn't like them. And when we try not to be that person, or we try not to be something, or not to be like someone, a lot of times we take that to the extreme, meaning we might go too far the other way. So if you had a very critical parent, you might be too non-judgmental or too easygoing with your own children. If you grew up with someone very needy, you might be too detached from your own neediness or too independent, too self-sufficient. If you grew up with someone who had an anger problem, you might never express anger or dissociate parts of yourselves that feel angry, and then it could come out in ways that are passive aggressive or anger towards yourself or not standing up for your own needs. So when we try not to be like someone or like something or not to when we have a part of our of the way we've been treated that we don't want to see in ourselves, sometimes those parts of ourselves are there, but they get relegated to the unconscious and they get dissociated from our narrative about who we are. So we don't know those parts of ourselves. We don't see those parts of ourselves. And sometimes we'll end up having children or people in our lives that will remind us of these parts of ourselves we don't like, that will remind us of other people in our lives, maybe parent figures or other authority figures that did things to us that we didn't like. And then when you see that in your own child, it can be very difficult because you love the person, or when you see it in your partner, you might love the person and not want to see that. But the hardest part is not seeing it inside your own self. So one of the things I've noticed in therapy is that a lot of times people come in and they they've worked very hard to try to live a kind of life that they want to live and to put the past behind them and not be like people in their lives that maybe they didn't like if they had difficult parents or a dysfunctional family or there was no structure in their family or there was too much structure in their family, right? People develop a certain conscious idea of what they want for themselves going forward. But unconsciously, unless they've worked it through in therapy or through other methods of working through the unconscious, a lot of times those parts of ourselves are still there and they're just buried or repressed. And so they leak out or they come out in us trying to distance ourselves from people who have some of those qualities, even if it's less extreme or even if we need to interact with those people. So it kind of comes out in other ways when we haven't resolved these aspects of ourselves. And when people come in, those parts of themselves that are like their caregivers or like the people or things in their lives that they didn't like are a lot of times very split off from consciousness. And people will not talk about it. They will not go there. So if somebody grew up with a very angry parent and they're being passive aggressive towards their child, and you try to point out to them that they seem angry, they will deny it, for example, right? Because anger is something they don't want to see in themselves. So what ends up happening is these things are there, they're coming out, but we don't want to admit to ourselves that they're there. And what I found is that when people feel safe enough to go to those places, to be able to integrate the parts of themselves that they don't like, or that remind them of people they didn't like, or experiences they didn't like, and they're able to see that that's a piece of them, but it's not the whole them. It's a part of themselves and it's there for a reason, and it maybe was even there to protect them in some way, and it may be a key even to empathy for people that were difficult, but it doesn't define the person. It doesn't have to be a threat. It can be something that you can see inside yourself without feeling like it's going to take over or it's something very threatening to think about. And those are the places where the deepest change happens. Those are the places where we start to really get in touch with parts of ourselves we've been afraid of, and our ability to be flexible in relationships and in our own feelings and the way that we see things, and to be open to our full selves and feel very free and liberated from repeating the past by trying so hard not to repeat the past, right? That's really where the change happens, is when people can start to own those disowned parts of themselves and bring those parts of themselves back into consciousness, and even find love and compassion for those parts of themselves that they've always tried to, again, counter-identify with or push away or not be. And that's really where a lot of the deep healing comes from, is being able to take those parts of the self and to embrace those parts, to accept them, to try to hear them out and listen to them, as opposed to just continuing to keep them split off. I think IFS has a lot to say about this when we look at different parts of the personality, but really a lot of different types of therapy can help a person with this. But the idea is really to go to the place you don't want to go in terms of seeing parts of yourself that feel very scary to think about or to see. If you're able to go there, I believe that you'll feel a lot of freedom at the end of the process, maybe some grief, and maybe some increased self-acceptance and a little bit less defensiveness in general in your life. So, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to post. I'll try to respond.